beer, it's good for you.
Hello and welcome to the video. Within this video I'll be sharing a tried and tested recipe for a vanilla porter along with all of my methods and plenty of hints and tips from the A to Z of this process. So let's get started. Let's now begin with a look at the recipe's vital statistics. As you can see, the recipe offers an approximate ABV of 6.4%, which in my experimentation has been the flavour sweet spot here. Certainly you could brew this at a lower level, but it will certainly not sing as brightly. The BU-GU ratio shown almost at the bottom shows the relationship between bitterness and alcohol at 0.39, making this one rather dangerously easy drinking beer. This recipe, just like all of my shared recipes, has gone through various stages of development and tweaking to reach its current state, which gets my full approval, so please do brew this with confidence. The recipe used here can be found in full within the video's description, which is underneath the video window when viewed on a desktop computer. You will also find a link there to the full recipe on Brewfather, which can be used free of charge with some restrictions. I strongly suggest that you fully convert the recipe before ordering in your ingredients so that you're actually brewing the recipe as it is intended. I also strongly suggest that you brew the recipe as is the first time, rather than trying to tweak it, as tweaks are already in place to bring this recipe into a very good shape. I have an easy guide to recipe conversion using Brewfather on my channel as shown on screen now. Within this video, this recipe is being brewed using a Brewzilla 65 litre Gen 4 brewing system to the volume of just 10 litres or 2.64 US liquid gallons, but as part of the conversion process, this can be scaled and shaped to suit your own brewing system and of course your own volume requirements. If you are wondering why I just brewed 10 litres, then it is simply because I still have plenty of litres of this recipe left whilst I was experimenting, and frankly they're all in very good shape. This version that I'm sharing with you is simply the final Golden Master recipe and of course is an improvement on those. Shown on screen is the water profile that I recommend for using with this recipe, which is the widely used Dublin profile that is superb for stouts and dark ales. Using the right water profile is very important. After all, beer is mostly water, and its balance is vital so that it suits the beer that you are brewing. Naturally, this water profile is just one way to go here. If you have a different profile that you really enjoy with this kind of beer style, then go with that. But just bear in mind that this recipe was written with this profile in mind, and has been tweaked according to the results obtained whilst using the profile. Brewfather has very good documentation on how to use the software to make the necessary water changes too. This makes the whole process very easy, so as such I suggest that all brewers, irrespective of experience, start treating their water as soon as possible for the very best of end results. You may well be surprised how easy this actually is. So let's get started with the brewing process, and this starts with the mash. This begins by preheating your mash water to the first mash step temperature and then adding and mixing your grain. Here you can see me doing my mixing, and it is at this point that you can get a feel for how your water volume is working with your grain. In terms of consistency, the mash should feel like thick porridge or oatmeal. It should not be so dry that you can see our mixed grains, nor should it be excessively watery. In this case I noticed the consistency did not feel quite right, as it was a little bit too much on the thick side, but nothing major, so I added a small amount of water to optimise. This water came out of my sparge water to ensure that the volume was still going to be correct at the end. If you want to make life easier, then using a tool like this one attached to a drill is a great choice for speed and ease, or you can simply use a mash paddle for your mixing. Either way, you want to stir thoroughly to ensure that all of the grains are evenly wet. Dry pockets can hinder enzymic activity and of course sugar extraction. There should be no clumps or dough balls, as some people call them, as these will result in an uneven conversion. After the grain was all nicely mixed in, it was time to start the actual mash. This one has a pretty regular mash in temperature, as you can see, and this in part leads us perfectly well towards our predicted final gravity of 1.011, which will lead us to the clean balanced flavour profile this recipe looks for, with a slight hint of residual sweetness. Let's now take a look at the grain bill. At 68% we have Mares Otter malt. This provides the bulk of our fermentables along with its rich biscuit, nutty and slightly sweet malt backbone, which you simply will not get with a regular pale malt. Then at 15% we have Munich malt, which adds in some extra depth for this recipe and further richness along with some light, toasty, bready, sweet malt flavours. At 5% we then have Carafa Special 3, which is a dehusked chocolate malt that provides smooth roasted flavours including notes of coffee and dark chocolate. This addition will also contribute to colour with that nice deep brown that you can already see in this mash. Do not replace this with regular chocolate malt. Ensure that it is dehusked, otherwise you will need to add this grain at the end of your mash to avoid any astringency. Also at 5% we have Caramel Malt 50, which means 50 EBC in colour, or as close as you can obtain. This will add in coffee, caramel, as well as subtle sweetness along with extra body and mouthfeel. Then we have flaked oats at a further 5% of our grain bill, which will offer mild, creamy and slightly nutty flavouring, along with a smooth texture that gives this beer its velvet name. These oats will also improve mouthfeel and head retention. Then lastly at 2% we have black malt. This is a malt to use sparingly as it can add a sharp dry edge if used in higher quantities. In terms of flavour contribution it adds in intense roasted flavours with notes of char, coffee and dark chocolate. It will also contribute significant darkening to the colour. So as you can now see, this is quite a bit above a basic grain bill, and with the addition of vanilla we have a complex and tasty profile with a minimum interruption from any other ingredient including the yeast and the hops. It was then time to lift our grain basket. Before starting the sparge, I set the brewing system on its way to ramp up to the boil. When sparging, do be sure to do this as evenly as possible across the whole grain bed. Also note that the water level is not super high. Avoid this and your taste buds and efficiency levels will thank you. Now we move on to the boil stage. This first step here is to actually stir in all of the foam on top, which is mostly protein based. Not only will this avoid the dreaded boil over, but it will also allow the waste products to drop down to the bottom of your brewing system where they belong, so they can be left behind when you transfer. The result you see here is when this process has been completed. Let's now look at the boil schedule. As you can see, I'm using the modern boil time of 30 minutes and that we have two hop additions here, both with East Kent Goldings hops. The first addition at 30 minutes is purely for bittering, and then at 10 minutes we have an addition for flavour and aroma. When you add in these additions, it is vital that you give them a good stir in so they can start making their magic straight away. Let's now look at what we can expect from East Kent Goldings hops. Here you can see the East Kent Goldings profile from within the hop control software. You can see from this aroma wheel that East Kent Goldings offers relatively high levels of herbal and floral elements as well as lower levels of citrus. Earthy, lavender, honey, lemon, thyme, orange and floral notes are also mentioned. However, as these are a British hop, these elements are subtle compared to hops from regions like the USA, New Zealand or Australia, just as you will find with other European hops. Also, within a powerfully flavoured grain bill like this one, the elements of East Kent Goldings are going to be much further in the background, which for a porter style is totally the intention. So within this porter recipe you can expect East Kent Goldings to enhance the malt richness with its earthy and floral tones. They will also provide a balanced bitterness that doesn't overshadow the roasted coffee and chocolate or vanilla flavours contained. Furthermore, they will add complexity through gentle spice and herbal undertones that will complement well without vanilla. Overall, East Kent Goldings are an excellent choice for a porter as they will emphasise harmony and subtlety in the beer's flavour profile. East Kent Golding hops are usually very easy to obtain worldwide, but if you struggle then other types of Golding hops will certainly work just fine, as will Fuggles. After the boil, it is then time to cool down our wort. Here I'm using a Brewfather counterflow chiller that I have adapted for use with the Brewzilla. The first step before finishing the boil is actually to run boiling hot wort through it to sanitize. I did this towards the end of the boil, but you could do this at any stage of the boil. It really matters not. Once the boil was over, I then turned on the cold tap so that the counterflow chiller could get to work on cooling, and I ran wort through the counterflow chiller for a few minutes back into the brewing system, waiting for it to cool down more before then directing the flow into my fermenter for cooling and transfer. So the transfer started, and I have to tell you the smell was amazing very quickly. The foam that you see here is from my sanitation step, which is important to perform just before transfer to avoid any potential contamination. Let's now talk about yeast choice. For this recipe I really love the clean and fast result that you get by using Lutra Fake from Omega. However, this recipe will work with neutral yeast or with British yeast as your choice. I would suggest that you pick one that has an attenuation rate that is at least as close to 82% to nail the balance that this recipe has using Lutra. Feel free to go with pressure fermentation too if your setup has that option. This will allow all of the intended flavours in this recipe to push forward. This should be performed at no higher than 1 bar of pressure to ensure that the yeast is totally happy. When using Lutric without pressure, I suggest a fermentation temperature of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. This keeps things very clean. Naturally, if you're using pressure, then you can push that temperature even higher. Next, you will need to get yourself the items shown on screen. Here we have an airtight small container, a bottle of spirit, a sharp knife, a chopping board, and then we have a Madagascar vanilla bean. I'm using one of these for a 10 litre batch, but if I was brewing for a 19 litre corny keg, then I will go with 2. It is important to go with the Madagascar vanilla bean as these have a higher concentration of the desired vanilla flavour. The type of spirit is not important as long as it's drinkable. We simply need to sanitize that vanilla. The container could be larger, but then you're going to use more spirit. The chopping board is optional, but my wife would simply kill me if I used the kitchen workbench, so chopping board it is. You might also want to wear some gloves in case you chop off a finger or two, but I will leave that to you. The very first step is to cut the vanilla in half. Some like to scrape out the seeds, but personally I notice no difference in the effect by doing this, so I conserve my energy these days and simply cut it in half. Then cut the vanilla into smaller pieces as you can see me doing now so that they fit into your container. This also provides more surface area for the vanilla to mould in from. You can then add the vanilla into a clean and sanitary container and cover it with your spirit. You can then lock your lid and then leave this for at least a day to sanitize the vanilla. You then want to add the vanilla into a clean and sanitary hop sock or similar. My preferred method is that this is added to the bottom of a keg along with the spirit, and you can then transfer the fermentation finished beer on top. Give the beer at least 2 weeks before sampling. If you were bottling, then I suggest transferring your beer into a secondary fermentation vessel, ideally into a carboy or demijohn filled to the neck on top of the spirit and vanilla hop stock, and leaving it for between 1 to 4 weeks before transferring to your bottles. Let's now take a look at the finished beer, starting with the pour, and I will then give you my tasting notes. You can see that the pour is a beautiful dark brown colour, but once in the glass the end beer is even darker brown, leading into black, so just as you would expect for this type of beer style. This beer has been under 12 psi of pressure, which is 0.83 bars, and I'm using this pressure for serving too. The example you see here is around the 4-week point from kegging, and is conditioned flavour-wise very nicely in this time. However, you will likely find that if you have tried this beer in another week or two, then the vanilla flavour can be more pronounced if you stored it within the keg. I've stored this beer in a keg within my kegerator at 7 degrees Celsius or approximately 44 degrees Fahrenheit, but when I serve it I let it stand for at least a few minutes before actually diving in for the tasting. This is because I find that this style and other dark styles like stouts, that this is best for my taste buds, so all of the flavours can be completely enjoyed. We will taste things a little differently though, of course, so do your own testing here for sure, but whatever you do not taste beers just very cold, as often you will miss out on some of the flavours for all styles. Let's now go through my tasting notes, starting with aroma. The aroma found here is very inviting with lots of vanilla and sweet malts that tease you before you dive in. Flavour. On entry you might well be fooled into thinking that this is a much stronger beer than being just 6.4%. The clean texture is velvet-like, and the vanilla flavour gives in part an alcohol-like impression, as it is present alongside moderately sweet caramel and toffee, which hit a high note in the middle with the vanilla in the forefront backed with the caramel and toffee as complementary flavours to keep the beer from being too one-dimensional. The finish is clean and smooth, and often carries with it subtle roasty coffee and chocolate notes, which form the aftertaste. As you get further down the glass, there is also a subtle background dark fruit that actually join the party, especially if you let the beer warm up a little bit more. I really personally enjoy playing with porter and stout recipes along with additions like vanilla. The challenge here is to have your flavours of choice in the forefront and your background flavour as well, in the background. Certainly this is a vanilla porter in true form, but as you have already heard, there is much more on offer here than just vanilla, which to my mind can be rather bland, and much work has been done with this recipe to form the correct balance of all the different flavours. I find that most people when drinking this beer naturally want to savour it like they would a stronger beer, like an imperial porter for example, because that is clearly part of its impression. So here is my final impression. This is a velvety smooth porter with vanilla, with complementary porter flavours in balance that will fool the drinker into thinking that it's a stronger ABV beer than it actually really is. So there you have it. Please do let myself and the community know what you think of this video, and then later on, once you've brewed this recipe, your own tasting notes if you would be so kind. Your feedback is both highly valued and also very much appreciated. I do hope that you found this video useful, informative and interesting. If so, why not consider liking and subscribing? For further support you can join the channel's Facebook group, and if you would like to support the channel then check out the channel's merchandise store, as all profits go back into the channel. Until next time, happy brewing!